Welcome to this Frequency Matters podcast. I'm Pat Hindle, and I'm here with my co-host Eric Heim. And today we're talking with Chief Chris Moore. He's a veteran of law enforcement executive with over 34 years of public safety experience. He currently serves as a subject matter expert for Public Safety Broadband Technology Association, or PSBTA. And his expertise spans many facets of public safety, including field operations management, emergency communications, 911 operations, internal affairs investigations, and media relations crisis communications. And over the course of his public safety career, he's been a police officer, firefighter, and EMT. So I think he's done it all. Welcome to the podcast, Chief Moore.
Thank you, Patrick. I appreciate the opportunity.
So we really want to talk about, FirstNet. What was the impetus for starting it? What kind of got it all going?
Well, appreciate the opportunity again. As I said, let's start with this. For those of your listeners that aren't as familiar with what FirstNet is, I know many people in this space have heard of it. They think they know what it is, but may not know the details. So let's start with this. What is FirstNet? FirstNet is the one and only congressionally mandated, dedicated, nationwide wireless public safety broadband network. Now, you take all those words, that's a lot of words, but each of them has a very specific purpose when you specifically talking about dedicated. So what was the impetus? Well, if you think back to what happened, the events of 9/11 and some of the communications failures that existed in New York and elsewhere, it became really clear after the 9/11 Commission report that more spectrum was needed and a network that was interoperable for public safety to operate not only on the land mobile radio side, but also on the data side. And if you think back to that era, and I remember working in 911 center in 2004, 2005, the extension of broadband technology and cell phones, we'll call it for that, into the field. And what that opened up in the way of applications and new technology that we knew at the time was new and basically just starting out. But there were many of us that were, myself, Chuck Dowd, who ran the 911 center in New York City at the time of 9/11, we all saw the future and said, look, we're going to need more spectrum. Or if not more spectrum, we needed to have the ability to run large streams across our networks, video streams, things like that. And it became reality to us that the carriers were not going to provide us what we were looking for, which was, hey, look, when we have an emergency, it's usually in a localized area, but we're going to need all of the spectrum that's in that particular 10 block, 20 block area. And the carriers that were in the broadband space at the time realistically said, hey, we're not going to give you the priority and preemption you need when you want it. And that's just because you're not that big a customer. And it became incumbent upon us as a small group to say, okay, we need our own network and we need our own ability to do that. So that's what sort of started the effort for FirstNet. What was the impetus? That was the impetus. And I think, it turned out to be something spectacular.
So 9/11 was the driving feature for that. And you've spoken a little bit about some of the challenges. How was the system developed and deployed, and who is it intended to serve?
Okay, again, back to that definition. First of all, Eric, thanks very much for the question. It goes back to the original purpose of this network is for public safety. It's for police, fire, EMS, and those related fields that are covered by the legislation, strictly for them. It's dedicated. You have your own network core. You are not competing with anybody else. It's like your own private freeway that you have the ability to communicate across the entire bandwidth that we own. Again, just by way of reference for those who don't know that more of the history, what we did is we went to Congress. So, the carriers aren't going to provide us this. Went to Congress, went to White House at the time and said, look, they're not going to do what we need. We need to have our own network and we need to have our own spectrum. There was a block of spectrum called the D block, which was in the 700 megahertz band. And for those of your listeners, and I know there are many that know how valuable that spectrum was and is today, it's basically has some of the best propagation characteristics for those of us in the field. It'll go through some windows. It'll go through, in the hills. It's, put it this way, it's the low band that we used to have for a lot of hilly areas and communications. It had its limitations. Back then, the higher band, the idea of being able to use the most prime real estate, and 700 was certainly prime real estate. Use whatever analogy you want to use, beachfront property, downtown Manhattan, and we were competing for it. And we necessarily, it's public safety. This isn't somebody trying to make money. This is people trying to provide for the men and women in the field that protect all of us to give them the tools that they need. And that meant getting the spectrum. So in effect, what it was going to Congress to say we need a direct allocation of spectrum rather than going through the FCC, because quite frankly, at the time, the FCC thought that we were not that valuable a user. And that's not to say they didn't, think highly of us, but they're looking for the highest, best use of spectrum. They weren't necessarily sure how that was going to work for us. There's more history on sort of what was the Public Safety Spectrum Trust in an attempt with another private partner to put something together nationwide. It did not work out. It became incumbent upon us that we're facing this effort, coming together to say we need to do this. Let's find the right way to do it. And that was to develop a set of what we believed necessary parameters, first principles, we called them, be able to say we need a nationwide. That means no individual state's going to run off in their own direction. Many parts of the United States back then, and certainly even to this day, do not have the coverage that first responders deserve. And there was a concern amongst a lot of the smaller agencies in this country that if, the major cities, the group that I was representing on this effort, and the major county sheriffs and others, that only the major jurisdictions, the big populated areas, would get coverage. And in public safety, coverage is king. It always is. It's always about coverage. So we had to make sure we put in our request for the legislation a mandate that all areas of the country, including rural America, would be covered with the same level of service. Now, the reality of that, for those who are in the radio business, know that it's almost impossible to have 100% landmass coverage. There are certain places in this nation that are just designed so that you don't have that kind of infrastructure that's necessary. Now, we had a requirement that we suggested, and it was included, a requirement that whoever the ultimate bidder and operator of the network would have to be able to provide service in designated percentages of the country in rural America. We've been very successful in that effort. The other thing that's really, really important is that this is a self-sustaining network. We knew that Congress wasn't going to give us lots of money now and spectrum worth $20 billion and then come back and have us ask for more money. This had to be self-sustaining. So the idea was you build up money from service fees dedicated to this, all have to get plowed back into the network so that you can expand the nationwide coverage. And we have done that, or FirstNet has done that over time. Is it 100%? No, it isn't. And frankly, I'm not sure 100% terrestrial coverage is always going to be achievable. But with that, you also have a requirement in there that there's a lot of other satellite backup and other things as that technology advances. And we've seen that advance significantly in the last 10 years with low Earth orbit satellites and things like that, to be able to bring the network to the incident. I'll use the major Western fires or any major fire anywhere in the country that we have, or a natural disaster where you don't have the infrastructure that you can bring it with you to operate. Or in the case of, let's say, a hurricane or any number of them that have happened, or natural disasters of any type, that you can bring in satellite assets and others to provide coverage where it's not provided. So to your point, is it 100%? Nope. Should it be? Absolutely. Are we getting there? Yes. Is it there yet? Now? No, it's not.
Yeah, that was actually one of my questions. I saw the coverage map and it was pretty close to 100%, except there were some big patches out west that weren't quite covered. So is there plans to, fill those in, or are those areas that it's not needed in?
No. I think the plan is always that you're going to get, and that's our goal. I mean, I'll tell you, as somebody who helped lead this effort, is, where it's needed, it's needed. And that's the problem with emergency communications. You never know where the emergency is going to be or how long it's going to be and how large. I wish we did. Then we could plan for optimal coverage. You just can't do that. But the reality is, with satellite technologies and some small form factor abilities, we can bring the network in effect to you out in the field, and that's the ultimate goal. And with the reoccurring revenue that comes in from use of the service, dedicating it all, so we're talking billions of dollars every year that are being plugged back into the network by the FirstNet Authority. Now, if you don't mind, I'll just talk a little bit about the FirstNet Authority. And I know I will get to all of these questions, but a lot of these issues come up into the questions that you may have, and so I might as well put them out there. One of the other features of the FirstNet network is that it, by design and by congressional intent, is that this is an independent entity. The FirstNet Authority is an independent entity within the Department of Commerce. So it has a board of directors that is appointed by the Commerce Secretary, but it includes a large number of public safety officials, as well as local government officials, finance people, telecom people. People actually know how to run these networks. They're the ones responsible for allocating funds for the continued development of the program, any other issues that need to be addressed to make sure that this thing is a ongoing and long-term project, recognizing that technology changes and what was in vogue and used 10 years ago may be superseded by other technology that's out there. So again, it's not like your typical carrier where you're going to have the primary profit motive, or the motive is profit for a carrier. And we should not be upset with that. Carriers have responsibilities. That's why they build where people are, because that's where revenue is. All right. We didn't, when we went to their networks originally to say, would you provide us this coverage? And here's the irony. We went to those same networks and we said, look, would you provide us priority and preemption when we need it, which isn't very often. In fact, it's rare when we really need all of it in one particular block area, whatever. But if you have an explosion or something, you're going to end up using all of it. And they just said it's just not in our shareholders' interest to do that. And that was an honest answer. And I to this day, people say, well, they were trying to gouge you. No, they're just trying to stay in business and, do what they're supposed to do. We needed something a little bit different. And we realized there could be a business model, and there is one. It's been one of the most successful public-private partnerships that has ever existed in the civilian space. Public safety has, as part of a long procurement process that was, one of the largest ones ever in this type of space, is a 25-year contract. It was competitively bid, 25-year contract, and it happened to be won by AT&T. That's why when you see the symbol FirstNet, operated by AT&T, that is by contract. But the authority, the FirstNet Authority, is an independent authority made up of public safety people that manage the investment decisions. That is all about making sure that public safety, this is a network built for specifically public safety, managed by a contractor who is held to account by the FirstNet Authority board that is made up of, again, people who are experts in the field. And the other thing is there's another entity created in the statute. In addition to having a board, you also have a technical committee that advises the board that has some of the experts that represent a number of people in the field, to include not only police, fire, EMS, but a lot of other folks that have an interest in making sure we have emergency communications. And they advise that board on where, when, and how things need to be either upgraded, changed, to whatever the policy issues are. They can advise the board. So I think in short, this was something special that was created out of something that clearly was a need. Again, we were up against a lot of opposition to build this network. And I think what happened is we had a vision, and public safety came together for the first time. And I will tell you, this has been an interesting ride to have police, fire, and EMS leadership all talking with the same message. And that was really, when I started this effort, I thought it was mission impossible. We were told it could never happen, but through the core effort of a number of people, and although I get a lot of credit and others on our team, Jeff Johnson on from the International Association of Fire Chiefs and Metro Fire Chiefs, Chuck Dowd from New York City, Dick Murgon from APCO, and many others. We couldn't have done this certainly by ourselves, but that grassroots effort really showed that when public safety speaks with one voice, Congress will listen, and I believe will respond.
So we've talked a bit about some of the commercial aspects and the implementation, all very important issues. But what can you tell us about the hardware and how it's different from what's used in other networks?
So it's first of all, that's part of the beauty of this, to make it nationwide and interoperable, is that basically you're using a lot, the basic technology of wireless communications. You're using a lot of the same devices. It all comes down to the chip, the Band 14 chip. And remember, there's only a few companies that actually make these very large companies that make these batches of cell phone chips that they make by the hundreds of millions, if not billions, of chips that go into the phones that we all have, our iPhones or any other type of Android device or whatever. We were told, just a funny story here, when we were starting this effort, first of all, you don't have the spectrum to do this. You don't have any money to do this. You don't have any devices to do this. You don't have any chips that can go into these devices. And we were told, I was told, look, it's going to take you a minimum of 5 years to get a chip, and then maybe 10 years to get the device in the field. Well, I took that as a challenge, and after some great conversations with some good people at Qualcomm and others, they included in their Snapdragon chip, 10 years ago, the Band 14 chip. And now you have all the, it's Band 14s in most of the devices that are out there today. So it makes it very easy to take any of those devices. You just have to get yourself, for those who are eligible users, to get the FirstNet chip and have it put in your phone. So the other thing about the devices is we like them to be, and we would prefer them to be, although we don't tell people you have to have certain devices. You just have to have band 14 and be eligible. But we want it to be ruggedized because in our environments, on the law enforcement side and certainly in the fire side and the EMS side and others, that you're out in the elements, your typical cell phone, although a lot of our users use those and they're very functional and they know how to operate them in tough environments, those that are ruggedized, hardened devices tend to do better, particularly on the fire ground or in the weather and the events and law enforcement. You'll get into tussles, you'll drop things. We tend not to be as careful. So we prefer, and I would prefer as a user, to have a device that if I dropped it, it wasn't going to shatter and ruin it. The flip side too is if you think of what I used to carry and look, the land mobile radio side, and I know you guys are from that space, both Eric and Patrick, but I always appreciated the fact that the radio that I carried, I know when I pushed the button, I was going to get A, coverage vast majority of the time, and more importantly, B, if I dropped it or went in a pool or God knows what it happened to it, it would work. We have to really do some damage to it. Cell phones aren't, the commercial versions aren't particularly designed to do that. But they're also a whole lot less expensive than what we were paying for our Motorola radios. Those radios, they cost a fortune, but they worked and they had a very simple purpose. But when you're looking about your cell phones and your communications devices today, the capability of those devices far exceeded what the old LMR handset radios would provide. So again, on the equipment side, it's pretty straightforward. Now we've talked a little bit about some of the requirements in the legislation to make sure we had some satellite when networks either go down or otherwise impeded from working, that we have crisis units. I won't call them crisis. They're designed for emergency response is what it is. And you can, they'll have cows and colts and again, other satellite assets, rapid deployable devices that you can bring out into the field. So if you don't have coverage wherever you are, you can actually bring it with you. There's work that's associated with that. But other than that, I mean, any wireless device that you typically would have, as long as you had the chipset for FirstNet, you can utilize it. Now, let me share one other thing about the number of devices. It's quite stunning to me. We weren't sure how fast this was going to grow. We knew it was going to grow, but there are over, at the end of the year, there was over 6.7 million users on the connections on the FirstNet network. And we're now just shy of 30,000 agencies, 30,000 in the United States that are using FirstNet. Now, why that's important, A, is that it shows that people like it and it works, but it also shows because in the requirement, we were quite clear in public safety to say, look, we don't want this to be a mandatory network. And they asked us, should we make this mandatory for our public safety? And the answer was no. And they said, well, why? You want to have drive user adoption. I said, we do, but we also don't want to restrict, there are certain places 10 years ago and to this day where certain existing carriers have better coverage. And we would never want a public safety entity to work with nothing but the best available coverage. So if you are operating right now, let's say you're on a Verizon network and you're getting better coverage, then we should not restrict you from doing it. So the idea there, again, is to get to those kinds of subscription numbers and get that kind of penetration in such a short period of time tells you how good the network is. And oh, by the way, there is a commitment and funding, self-funded, to create better coverage across the country. So the message to those who aren't FirstNet users, and I know they're out there, and then other companies, they're fighting hard for those customers, which is good for public safety. The competition is good for everybody, in my mind, for public safety to get the best coverage possible in as many places for as long as we can and continue. The funny joke, and it's not a joke, but it's the reality. When we were going to the carriers asking them, hey, look, can you do this for public safety? Not very often, but when we need it, we need it. And they said, no, it's just not in our interest. They just thought we were such a small market share that they just didn't think it was important. Well, now with the advent of FirstNet, you got all of the carriers running Super Bowl ads trying to compete for the public safety, customer, which to me is great. That competition. I want people to be giving their best offerings to public safety at the lowest prices so we can get done what we need to get done. And we're seeing that. You're seeing a lot of folks that are trying, those that are not the FirstNet network trying to compete. The fortunate thing for them, and they had the opportunity to compete for the first time, and some chose not to, and some didn't win. They didn't put forth the best proposal. So I will say this is that for those who are looking, FirstNet is the one and only a dedicated core. You're not, splicing off or slicing off portions of other people's networks subject to other people's rules. The FirstNet network is its own network. Now, AT&T has their own commercial network, but it's a separate core. And one of the deals that we have that was incorporated in the contract, which I thought was outstanding, is that we get all of our spectrum all the time. All right. When we need it, we get it. It's ours. And oh, by the way, if we need beyond what we have in the 20 megahertz, we get access to their spectrum on our party as well. So again, they understand that we don't need it all the time everywhere, but when we need it, we need it. And that's one of the great things about this network. So I hope that answers the long-winded version, but important for people to know. This was really well thought out over a long period of time to make sure that public safety got what it needed in a model that worked for everybody on the financial side. Because you can't really build, we originally thought we were going to build our own networks, greenfield networks. And we were thinking public safety, we always built our own stuff. We don't trust anybody else to build it. Well, let me tell you something. When I looked at the eye-popping numbers to build a greenfield deployment across the United States everywhere, hundreds of billions of dollars. I mean, it made a whole lot more sense to have somebody who does it for a living overseen through a contract that is run by public safety. So that's how we ended up where we are.
Great. So you always talk about this network being secure, reliable, for first responders and interoperable. I think, 20 years ago, a big deal was, fire couldn't talk to police and, there wasn't interoperability between states and systems. So can you talk a little bit about how the network overcomes those and is secure, reliable, and interoperable?
Sure. So just backing up a second, just to give you some context for this, because it's really an important point. Again, part of the reason we all came together on what we said, a nationwide, this isn't a national network. This is run by public safety. It's not run by the federal government. It is a dedicated, when we had, our old LMR radios, and this is not to criticize any vendor in particular, but there have been a couple large ones. I think you guys have even worked with others in the past that look, it's their job to be able to sell these systems, the old land mobile radio systems. And they were, millions, if not tens of millions, in some cases more, to build and refresh these networks. And they're very expensive to do, especially when you're doing it in a small jurisdiction. And the next jurisdiction has different frequencies. And then the next jurisdiction across state lines, even though you're right next to each other and interoperate, work together all the time, nobody could talk to each other. And that part of that was by design. It was the business model that people had to be able to build all these independent networks on different frequencies, but it made it almost impossible for all of us. Now, there were efforts through APCO and others, through P25 and others, to sort of join these networks, but it was disjointed. And quite frankly, everybody in the space will tell you it was not what we envisioned. We didn't want to do that in the broadband space. We wanted a nationwide network. We know it existed so that if I were working in California and we got deployed to a natural disaster of some type in southern Florida, we could bring our devices, and through the nationwide aspect of this, we could actually communicate with one another. And that was really one of the most important things, that we have the ability to do it. Now, when you have one network, dedicated network with one core, you have a lot better ability to control the security of that network. I mean, anybody that's in the radio space knows the more opportunities you have people coming into a network, that opens up opportunities for mischief. And we don't want that. This is a mission critical nationwide asset. So we want to make sure it's the most secure possible. That said, is it possible for somebody to break into it? Now, there are a lot of smarter people out in the world that are actually trying every day to compromise our networks. It's just, foreign actors, nation states, others. So we leave it to those experts. I wish I could say I knew how to do all that myself, but part of the criteria for this network is that it would be safe and secure. Now, with respect to the interoperability, look, it's like any other cell phone in the sense that if I'm a Verizon customer, can I communicate with a FirstNet device? You can, as you can on other networks when people talk. The reality is the other folks, the other vendors that provide cellular services to public safety can't offer and don't offer, as much as they may talk about network slicing and things like that, the ability to have true, what we call ruthless preemption and priority. It's not just a priority, well, next in line, hey, I'm clicking the mic or I'm keying up my device and I'm trying to send something, but that network is already saturated. That was the whole point of this is we have our own network. So if somebody happens to be using it, we're going to wipe them off the network and we're just going to go ahead and take priority and use that spectrum. 10, 12 years ago, that technology we were told didn't really exist. Well, guess what? It exists today and it's used today. And so, people ask me, what's the difference between, FirstNet and the other carriers? Well, again, it's the only one dedicated wireless public safety broadband network and designated by Congress with its own spectrum so we can do this stuff so you don't have to rely on other people to do this. So it's, is it secure? Yes. Is it interoperable? Absolutely it is. One thing to remember is those carriers that are not FirstNet, they don't have some of the technology that we have. So to the extent, do they have everything that FirstNet does? No. So are they interoperable? Yes. Do they have all the features that FirstNet has? No. And people need to understand that. But again, coverage may trump that in places where certain carriers have better coverage. And I would never want anybody to choose the best. If you're a public safety leader and you hear this message is, hey, do your homework, talk to your neighbors. That's the best thing. We all talk to each other, say, is this work? Is it not work? Because I don't want to go down this path. And all of a sudden you're trying to people say, okay, it does work. Is it perfect? No, but it's better than whatever I'm using today. We've also seen people that have used both. They'll, more than one network just to make sure if they know they have certain coverage in certain areas that they can actually use another one. It's more expensive to do that. Now you add on top of that, let me bring up one other issue with respect to interoperability, and that is this notion that a lot of folks say, hey, look, we can just use FirstNet. We don't need to refresh, or we can basically abandon our land mobile radio systems. When I first heard that, I said, given the nature of communications 10 years ago, I would have said there may be an off ramp to that. There is an off ramp to that eventually. The technology will make it such that it would be just as reliable for your cell phone network and your broadband network to use voice over, push to talk over the broadband. The reality is today, is it there yet? It exists today. We have a department in Dallas, Georgia. If you've not heard this already, they have moved off of their LMR and successfully moved all of their communication efforts to FirstNet. Now, I applaud the chief for doing that. Did a lot of homework at the front end in preparation so that, and if you talk to their people, they're not going to notice a whole lot of difference. If I'm a chief at this point, I know we're headed that direction. And I think as broadband gets better and mission critical push to talk is more adopted, people are going to get more comfortable with that notion. I think that's important. And I do see that happening. It's just, is it today? In my mind, it isn't. That doesn't mean that it won't. And I applaud those who are taking the initiative to say, look, I can't afford to build and refresh new LMR networks when other technology may do the job moving forward.
Well, a little earlier, you mentioned band 14. Can you tell us what that is and why that's important in the network?
Sure. As I mentioned before, band 14, the lower bands, they have better propagation characteristics for public safety. So if you're inside of a building, you're more likely to get through a window or a wall. If you're in a garage, you're not going to get out as well as some of the lower band, but it is the perfect sweet spot for this communications in today's world. Now, moving into 5G, and that's where 4.9 spectrum is so important, is 5G is perfectly suited for some of those applications. You're not going to be able to penetrate some more walls and things like that at those higher frequencies, but it is robust. It's been proven. It covers a lot of terrain. So look, it is Manhattan real estate right there. And that's why we were told, quite frankly, that spectrum was too valuable for public safety. And I bristle when I heard that and hear it to this day, but we have proven a business model through FirstNet in the partnership with AT&T that you can have a self-sustaining network when you have spectrum. Now, again, for those who are more of the lay people and with respect to radio communications or any communication, public safety communications is absolutely critical. You cannot do your job until you provide the people in the field doing the work, getting them information, getting their questions answered, and providing service to the community without the ability to communicate. Well, I tell you what, in order to have communications, you have to have frequencies and you have to have a bandwidth. And those, that 700 D block band was absolutely phenomenal, and it still is to this day. And so we take the value of that spectrum, we put it to use every single day, certainly for public safety on priority, and then we're able to monetize it through the contract with AT&T, and that allows us to, again, take billions that are coming into the network and then, again, expand coverage over the entire country, or all 50 states, as well as the U.S. territories and the District of Columbia. I'll say one other thing with respect to, okay, how do you get that coverage? And this came up when we were planning for this is every state in the United States and the territories had to opt in. They had the opportunity to do their own network. And every single one of them saw the value of A, having a nationwide network, and B, them not having to pay for it, quite frankly. Otherwise they'd be spending billions trying to build their own. And some states could do it. And I mean, I come from California, we have a lot of money, and there was some talk about, hey, we want to build our own. The problem is every time you do that, you've got a patchwork of networks all across the country, and that introduces those security issues, operational issues. And so again, it's much better to have a nationwide network as opposed to different states doing their own different thing. Again, the states all had the opportunity, their governors had the opportunity to opt in or opt out. They all opted in, they saw the value of it, but they also, we required that FirstNet ask and consult with the states to determine where they needed their coverage. Like in Arizona, there are places in and around the Grand Canyon, they don't get coverage. And so one of the things that the Arizona government did, this is where we need new additional towers. Were they all going to get built on day one? No. It takes a while to do that. But with the funding, the ability each state sort of prioritize where they wanted their coverage. So there's a whole lot of collaboration with the states and the jurisdictions. And I would encourage anybody who is a FirstNet customer, frankly, even if you're not, is that if you had a coverage issue someplace, that you make sure that your FirstNet representatives know. And there's a process in your state to go through, whatever entity, the Office of Emergency Services or whatever it's going to be in your state, to make sure that your needs are known. And then when it comes time for allocation of funds for increasing coverage around the country, those priorities are that input is taken into consideration to get those new sites built.
Well, we're pretty much out of time, so maybe if you just had a couple quick comments about, the network, does it have to be reauthorized by Congress? Are there any issues there? And just quick on future plans so we can wrap it up.
Sure. I'll say this, the FirstNet legislation, again, it was one of the largest, certainly, outlays when you count 20 billion in spectrum plus the 7 billion in cash that came along with this. Congress wanted to make sure that they had oversight and made sure that's a whole lot of money to be dedicating on something that had never been done before. And so one of the things they did, they put in a 10-year reauthorization. They put a sunset on it, and that's coming up in 2027. And the idea is that Congress has to look at the record. They talk to people to say, is this worthy of reauthorization? And I would clearly say the record supports it when you have, in a very short period of time, developed a network that has, again, almost 7 million users or connections already, and over approaching 30,000 agencies across the country that are using it. It makes perfect sense. We have a lot of support for reauthorization from the vast majority of public safety associations, nationwide associations. The National League of Cities has endorsed the reauthorization. The U.S. Conference of Mayors, Conference of State Legislatures, Association of Counties, all of those jurisdictions that helped us at the beginning get this built say there's a track record here. It's one of the most successful public-private partnerships around, and we'd like to see it continue. So what we're looking for, in effect, is to have Congress do a very clean reauthorization and say, look, we're going to remove the sunset. They've proven themselves. And mind you, it's a 25-year contract, and we're already into it 10 years, or we will be. So at the time when other carriers that want to participate because it's successful, another 15 years out, they're going to have to recompete this, which is a good thing. Again, to me, it's always about competition. But while there is a contract and we have a provider that's providing good service to us and a growing customer base, and I think it's important that Congress step up and do that. And we're grateful to Congress. I mean, the Congress is a past and current for support of public safety. We've never seen anything like this, and we just have to prove ourselves every day that we're worthy of that trust and make sure that firefighters and police officers and EMS officials, the men and women that do the work. I mean, I used to do it. You guys used. It's not about us. It's about them in the field protecting us and our families. And so we want to see that continue for a long period of time. Hopefully that's helpful for you guys.
Yeah, thanks, Chief Moore, for talking with us today about FirstNet. It's certainly an important network, and you are certainly an expert. So thanks for that. This has been great. And to our audience, you can find more podcasts at podcast.microwavejournal.com. And thanks for listening.